Off-season. It's a time of exciting roster announcements that make us look really forward to the new season, to seeing new teams kind of gel together, see who will rise, who will fall, and then some really not so exciting ones that pump people on Reddit to say things like, wow, this is atrocious, this team will instantly be relegated, if they win more games than Velocity, I will be shocked. I would have preferred an NALCS mid. What makes people instantly look at a roster and decide that this team is going to be trash? Because usually when I look at rosters, I will have my gut and my knee-jerk reaction, but a lot of times, like, I don't recognize all of the names right away. I have to think about it, and even if I do recognize all the names, I want to go back and watch VODs. I want to think to myself, okay, how is this going to work out? Who's going to play this way when the jungler's on this side of the map? Does the jungler have a history of what kind of pathing style, things like this, that make me decide whether or not the roster was put together well or not. But there are a lot of things that go into these gut reactions, right? There are a lot of inherent biases that we have in the community by what we perceive as a history of these kinds of things not working. Right. And so one roster that I really wanted to talk about that came out was Origen, because I think that the way that this roster came out and the way this roster was built up and the history of the organization in and of itself lended itself to some really interesting knee-jerk gut reactions. Some really interesting responses from the community that I think in some cases were overblown and over-rendered before people even started talking about how the roster works, before people even knew who the players were. First, let's talk about some really inherent biases that a lot of people have when they look at rosters that don't even go into how this Origen roster was built up, right? For example, let's talk about things that people don't like to see on rosters. Rookies. I think a really big reason people don't like to see rookies on rosters is because there have been some players who come in with slightly less game knowledge and experience. It's kind of hard to think around how the game will be played if you're brand new to the scene and you have to kind of grow into your teammates, and if you're focusing on learning to play LCS at the same time as you're focusing on working together with your teammates at the same time as you might be focusing on adapting to a meta, sometimes this can spread a player really thin. But recently we've had some exceptionally outstanding rookies in the LCS, right? We've had players like Perks, Knight, Febivin, Huni, Sven, Mike EX, players like this who have come out and just done really well almost immediately. So I think it's kind of hard to say that it's just having rookies in and of itself is bad. I do think if you look at these particular players, though, usually the rosters will have slightly more experienced players to go along with the rookies, so some kind of guidepost. This Origen roster has 3 rookies, okay? And those are going to be Sartorius, the top laner, Nahyun, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, I probably am, the mid laner, and Hiva the support. Alright, so the thing about these players is that I actually think that some of them are really interesting and will be pretty good. What I wanted to do when I was looking at these players was go back and look at some of their inherent knowledge that they might have, or what they might like to do in the game. And I find that Sartorius and Hiva have like a pretty good understanding of how they want to control a lane, or how they want to play in this particular fashion. When I was going back and I was watching Challenge France, because they both played in that in the off season, and LDLC was Sartorius' team, and there was a particular moment where it's like, okay, this guy kind of has an idea of what's going on, where he goes ahead and the enemy top laner TP's bottom, but he waits to push out the wave because he'd actually kept for most of the match. So this was the first indication. He kept the wave just like kind of a little away from the turret, and he was zoning his opponent off of it fairly well, pretty convincingly. So he understood like how to use this advantage, and the wave was held just outside the enemy turret, so the jungler could still take advantage of that pressure, things like that. That could work really well for the team. And so after the enemy top laner TP'd, he pushed the wave and bounced it off of the enemy tower, and then TP'd. And what this allowed him to do is that when both he and the enemy top laner returned to lane, he could continue to manipulate the wave the way he wanted it to, and the wave was like more towards his side, so he immediately had the control, and the enemy top laner wouldn't be able to get back into the game easily by getting back to lane before he did. Things like this were kind of interesting, kind of tipped me off to Sartorius. I still think he has a little bit to work on in terms of teamfight positioning, and I don't think he's going to be like an instantly good player, but I think that these are signs that maybe he could have like a good debut season where he's just really consistent and does well for the team. Hiva, I think, looked pretty solid also. Generally, when I went back and watched Hiva's games, he was trading well, he was standing on the right side of the minion wave, he was making trades with the team, he was kind of commanding the lane. Personality-wise, I don't know a lot about these players, so I can't really tell you how they're going to mesh or anything like this, but just these types of looks indicate to me that Origen have done a little bit of their homework, they've scouted a little bit of their own talent. The rookie that has the biggest question mark by its name for me, though, is going to be the mid laner Nahyun. And of course, famously, this was like the most violent reaction to this Origen roster, right? Was this guy went 0-17 in the League of Legends Secondary Pro League in China. And this league has 14 teams that play each other, okay? So they placed 14th, didn't win a single game, all right? All split. And not just him, but the other mid laner they had. So that's an indication right away that maybe it's not his fault. You know, the team was just bad. But you go back and watch his games, and he was really kind of out of it. Nahyun had a pretty good sense of how he wanted to snowball the lanes, and he was a good TP player or a good twisted player. Players that used these kinds of map pressure abilities. But what he did was he gave up a lot of ability to trade in the lane for that, and he fell behind a lot, and then when he did go to the side lane, sometimes he would just take a lot of kills. Then after he had those kills, he didn't seem to know how to position well in teamfights. There was one particular game where he just took literally all of the kills as Twisted Fate, and then when it came to teamfighting around Baron or setting up for Baron, he would port in at the front line and almost instantly die every time. It was really awkward to watch because it just seemed like he had no sense of where to place himself, what to do, and how to chain these abilities. And you might say, well, there are communication issues, etc., 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 but I feel like if there are communication issues in the LSPL, there are going to be communication issues on Origen as well. Then if you go back and you watch his solo queue games, he played a ton of Katarina, and he went to side lanes, and he snowballed, and all of these other aspects that indicate to me that this is just how he plays in solo queue, and he's basically a solo queue player who might not be the best in lane, so he compensates by just going to the bot side of the map, right, and just getting a ridiculous amount of kills. But you can't play like that in competitive. You get punished for that really, really easily when the enemy mid laner pushes back on you, right, and takes your tower, opens up, the enemy jungler gets control, you have too much vision so you can't go bottom easily, and have the strategy countered maybe later in team phase when some of the tanks come down from top lane. Things like this are just, it's not conducive to, I think, a competitive environment, and indicates to me that this guy just doesn't have a switch from between where he's playing in solo queue and where he's playing in competitive. So that's a big worry sign for me. And even when you talk about, like, I think Sartorius and Hiva are big pickups, these are not players who are going to, like, carry games for you necessarily. These are players who are going to perform well for rookies, right? And that's actually good, because well for rookies is a really high standard, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they will be like the big stars or anything like this. And then you look at the veterans on the roster, and this is another point that I think people have a lot of bias about, which is veterans that haven't played in the LCS for a while or in a pro league for a while, and then suddenly show up and are doing that again. And both players, Wisdom and Tabs. To Wisdom's credit, when he was playing in a top league for the Tigers, he wasn't really a main player. He didn't play as many games as Hojin, and he he didn't see a lot of playtime, so you can't really put him in the same category as Tabs. Tabs has been out of the LCS for a little bit longer. Tabs has kind of a controversial career that's really interesting, and which is why I think a lot of people, when they see Tabs' name on the roster, they might have an instantly violent reaction. For people who don't know, in 2014, Alliance was the top team in Europe. They made it to the World Championship, and there was a controversy when they didn't get out of groups and they lost to Kaboom, which was at that time really hilarious because they had also perfect gamed the Korean team in their group. And the controversy came out where part of the team was saying that Tabs was sleeping while other people were practicing, and then Tabs basically responded by saying, guys, I'm burnt out. It was a lot of work, and the community saw a lot of blame for that, and there are points on both sides, right? Because you should manage your time well enough for the most important tournament of the season, but at the same time, the LCS schedule is really, really grueling, and people were really, really just then getting into the grind of making this more than an 8-hour workday, right? Making this more than a 40-hour work week, making this literally all you do is eat, breathe, and play League. Sometimes sleep. So it's really, really easy to get burnt out. And some players, this point was made, might not need as much of a practice, things like this. The thing about Tabs, though, is that he was allegedly very communicative, right? And he spoke a lot on the team, so when Alliance came back to the LCS the next year without him, with Reckless instead, they just didn't do well at all. I think that there are a lot of other factors that contributed to that, like meta and the fact that other teams were playing much more aggressively and taking a lot more advantage of some of the openings that Alliance left in the early laning phase, things like this that weren't happening in 2014, but I do think that the Tabs factor was tunneled on a lot, so people kind of saw him as like this guy who could be a savior or this guy who was just lazy, and it was really polarizing, really divisive. When he did play, I would say that he used to be aggressive for 2014, so he would create some lane pressure and generate some lane pressure for Alliance, which was really good because that team really needed it. And then now he's not really that guy. He's not going to necessarily generate lane pressure for you. He's more of a guy who can understand openings and team fights to go in, get a few kills, and then back out like kind of elegantly, but it's not something that he can do on his own. So it requires particularly a lot of teamwork and a lot of cohesion, and I wouldn't really say that this indicates to me that he's a strong performer right now. And so when you look at the members on the roster that are the worst, you're kind of looking at Tabs and Nahyun. Wisdom is also a really interesting figure who falls into this kind of bias category, I think. And Wisdom, you hear a lot of different things from different people when you talk about Wisdom, and people will say, oh, he was the best jungler in Challenger in 2016 summer, right, when he was on Misfits. But then what happened, right? He was off the team when they played promotion and they brought in their substitute. It was a really weird kind of situation. So if he was this really sick jungler, why was he benched? Well, I'm not really going to talk about that, but what I am going to talk about is how Wisdom actually plays in the game. Okay, so Wisdom had a lot of hype and a lot of information, and I think this has to do with the way people were kind of perceiving the jungle role last year and the way people were perceiving how jungle was being played. So a big thing about how people played jungle relies a lot on communication with lanes and being able to generate a certain sense of pressure and flow in the lane. So if you had a laner who was constantly pushed out, it was really easy to invade on that side of the map. So if you had a top and a mid that were constantly pushing forward, it was really easy to invade. In Challenger, I think it was really easy for Alphari and Sylvie to constantly have this kind of pressure, and for Wisdom to do basically whatever he wanted. And if you see some of their games, they would have the lanes pushed out. Wisdom would basically go to the other side of the map and take the opportunity to just farm those camps and chase out the jungler. It wasn't necessarily something that it was good that he identified that they were doing that, but it wasn't like he was necessarily snowballing his lanes. In fact, he sometimes would delay purchases of vision items, and he wouldn't do a lot to sort of maintain these pushes forwards, but he would take advantage of them, and he'd be able to farm a lot, and he'd be effective in team fights. I think that if we're talking about so far how this team doesn't necessarily have a reliable carry, that might not be a bad thing. But on the other hand, if we can't get lanes going, if Nahun doesn't have a good sense of forward lane pressure, right, you're not going to have a mid that is enabling this type of jungle style. And so I think that's a little bit of a problem. That's actually a really, really glaring problem if Nahun cannot generate that kind of level of pressure. And in fact, he's often ceding pressure to try to snowball sidelines, and then he doesn't necessarily put the gold in the lanes, he puts it onto himself. Then maybe that's a conversation you just kind of have to have with him and be like, dude, either stay in lane or give kills to side lanes so that they can push forward. But it's either way, when you look at his 1v1 prowess, he's not really good at trades. He's not really good at keeping the CS push forward. And I think that if you can't really have a mid that can push forward reliably, like, it's almost like he picks the teleport and Twisted Fate and things like this to play to his strengths intentionally, because he can't play those situations really well. Yeah, I do think it's fair to have a certain amount of biases, but really ultimately what leads me to believe that this Origin roster is actually pretty terrible has nothing to do with the fact that, oh, they're rookies, we don't know how they'll play. Has nothing to do with the fact that, oh, it's a washed up AD carry who hasn't played the game. It has to do with me actually going and watching the games and trying to decide, okay, how do I think these pieces put together? What makes sense to me? Why is this good? Why is this bad? And I think that Origin are going to run into a lot of problems, certainly. So that's a negative thing. But something that was really unique to the Origin roster, though, that I think garnered the most violent reaction, okay, was the build-up and the history of Origen as an organization. And this is a really, really interesting story, okay? Because what happened was at the end of 2014, Europe had the terrible season at the World Championships where none of the teams made it out of the group stage, and Fnatic had that really memorable game with OMG where it came down to one auto attack on the Nexus, and they would have won, and there was the controversy over Loveling's Kha'Zix, but the truth is that if there was ever a game played where neither team deserved to win, it was that game. It was bad. So, I don't know what to say. But, after that, they split up. You had the Yellow Star Fnatic storyline of 2015 and the Origin Expecke storyline of 2015, and that was really memorable. But Expecke decided what he wanted to do was he wanted to take, money that he'd made as a pro player, and he wanted to go back into the scene. He wanted to start a team and an organization, and he wanted to re-qualify through the LCS like this. So this was already kind of a bootstrap passion project, and you're not seeing a lot of investment from the outset. When you talk about how the players got on that roster, it's almost like how all the pieces had to perfectly align for that team to form well. First of all, Soaz was also part of that Fnatic team when he went and decided to go to Origin. And the thing with Soaz was he has a long history of perhaps not practicing as much, and criticism from the community for doing that. I don't necessarily fall on one side or the other of that, but he made a few comments when I interviewed him and asked him at the end of 2015 about the split of Fnatic and what was kind of gained from that. And he said, I think Fnatic right now is much more serious. They play really methodical. Before, we played more with our feelings. I think it has helped Yellow Star a lot more with his style of calls. Okay, this tells me right now is that 2014's Fnatic lineup was much more about, feeling the right way around the map and doing things like this, where Fnatic in 2015 became like a much more rigorous model. The famous no hook, no food, etc., etc. But Origin, they were a team that kind of banded together. They didn't necessarily feel like they needed guidance or a coach, and they wanted to do things their way. So that's a really special kind of situation. The reason why he might say this for the 2014 roster is when you look at the way Fnatic played, it was a little messy at that World Championship, and in particular, his individual play was a little off. I think one of the weirdest moments was when I was saying, oh wow, okay, because OMG actually beat them with 4 players, because I like to rib on Dada7 a lot, because that guy was not a good player. And someone said, no, it was really much more like a 4v4. Did you see Soaz in that game? So that hurts. It's a little sting. I would not go that far, but I think Soaz definitely demonstrated a few gaps in skill, and it shouldn't have happened at that time given how skilled of a player he is and how experienced of a player he is. He had something to prove. If you look at Amazing, he also had something to prove, right? He was on the 2014 Team Solo Mid roster, and he was the one most blamed for Team Solo Mid's poor performances that year, right? Is that if he didn't get Lee Sin, he was awful. He had no champion pool. He was blamed for losing to Royal. He was blamed for losing to SK. He was blamed for losing to Samsung White. So, guy could not catch a break. He was not able to play for TSM the following year, and coming off of a ban, toxicity, he probably had a lot to prove, and so this kind of offer of, oh, we have these good players already, we would like to add you, and Sven was a brand new rookie. We already talked about how rookies can do really well their first split, and Sven was basically the carry of that roster for both 2015 and then 2016 spring. I think that this created a false sense of expectation that Origen could recreate a really strong, really good World Championship semi-finalist roster when there was absolutely no indication that they could, and the players that they'd signed previously were in a unique situation. If you even looked at the signings they made in 2016, Power of Evil, he wasn't necessarily on a star-studded team, and he was a player who had noticeable issues. He mostly was a mage player, right? And they said they were going to do a rotating roster with Expeke, acknowledging that he didn't necessarily have the most well-rounded playstyle. They added Forgiven and Hybrid. These were players who had basically just been kicked from their teams at the end of the spring season, so maybe they didn't necessarily have the most options. And I hesitate to say not have the most options, but they definitely were players who joined Origen who had something to prove. And you don't always get those storylines, especially now when people are throwing so much money everywhere, it's really hard to compete. And Origen have no indication that they have those kinds of resources. In fact, Origen's reputation as an organization is a little bit weird right now. Right now, I think that they kind of went into a better direction, picking up a CEO, things like that, but the history was, and the association was, that XPK's mom was running it, that XPK's mom's PR statements were really weird and controversial, and they did come out as kind of passive-aggressive and strange sometimes. The one about the alleged Origen staff members, that was weird. The one about the bot lane departure, that was a little weird. So I think that Origen rightfully kind of earned a weird reputation. And the thing about earning a weird reputation is that when you do that, you don't get sponsors very easily. You don't get money very easily. You can't get the big rosters that people were weirdly hyping up. The things like, oh, I bet they're going to get like Someday and Dandy. Maybe they'll get Dade. Point is that there was a lot of hype, and then like Vander, Selfie, Upset, all these players were at one point going to go to Origen and then ended up not. And I think this led to a really, really harsh feeling of letdown, a really harsh feeling of, wow, this roster sucks. This roster is going to get relegated, that I don't necessarily think it earned, right? I think it's a roster that I kind of expected would come out if you didn't have these exceptional circumstances with the really hyped, exciting players and things like that. That's what it ended up being. It ended up being 2 rookies that showed that they did their research really well. A third one that feels like, oh, we're running out of time, let's just grab someone. He's like kind of high ranked on the Korean ladder. Okay, it's good. Good, Nahyun. We'll throw in some stuff about how he do it with wisdom, and it'll look good on the. Yeah, feels like that. It probably isn't like that. Like, he probably did do it with wisdom. Wisdom probably did like him, things like that. But it feels like that. They have like a couple of players who have had solid recent histories in the Challenger Series. So I think that this roster is not really earning like the hate it is. I think that the way that the pieces kind of put together don't work, and that's why I rated them at the bottom of the table, even below Giants and Roccat. But I think it's a really, really interesting case study for why biases arise and why people start instantly look at names on a roster and they're saying, this is terrible. Why is this happening to me? I feel personally assaulted. Why, God, why is this a roster going to the LCS? And I just wanted to talk about that a little bit.